Okay, so today we're going to discuss the upcoming elections in South Africa. Look, I'm not going to take a point of view on who should or should not win. I'm just going to tell you what the facts of the situation are and what, kind of conclusions you can draw from historic, kind of stuff that happened, in other places in the world, etc. So let's start off with who we are. This is a little intro. Someone mentioned this might be the little ad at the start of the presentation. This is RandSwiss. What we do is securities broking, which basically means we allow you to buy and sell shares, derivatives, currencies, and so on. Managed solutions. We have model portfolios and structured products, one of which is closing this week, by the way. If you're interested, give us a call. And wealth and advisory. We help you with your investments, estate planning, risk assurance, insurance, stuff like that. As you may know by now, we are the top-rated broker in the country. We are also the top full-service broker in the country, top lump sum broker in the country, most improved, which is quite an impressive thing because we were also the top broker last year as well. So we're so 2 years ago, we were the best broker. We had an improvement and improved by so much. We were the most improved broker. And last year, of course, because we were number one and improved by the most, we were number one again. Okay. And the top relationship manager in South Africa as well. And we've won these awards for several years now. We've been number one, I think, 4 out of the last 5 years. And here's a little quote. A politician thinks of the next election, a statesman thinks of the next generation. Hopefully we have more statesmen in South Africa than politicians. Okay, so here is a little brief outline of what's going to be coming about. Okay, so before I start, if you have any questions, just please type them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will go through them if they're applicable to the point, or near the end if they're not quite applicable to that particular point that we're discussing. Okay, so national elections coming out. 30 years of full democracy, so basically 94 to 2024. The DA likes to talk about this, and there is some kind of evidence that this is, partially true, but you tend to find after about 30 years or so that most countries that have gone through independence, we have a huge sample size. We're talking about Africa, Asia, and so on that have gone through independence around 30 years or so, on average after that independence. You tend to have the ruling party lose power. It doesn't always happen. I mean, look at China, for instance. And even in places like India, where the party lose power, it came back and was only truly out of power, one can say really in the last 10 years or so, almost 30 years after the first 30 years were done. But there's a significant chance right now, not just on historical numbers, but also on current polling that shows that the ANC has a significant chance of losing power or losing majority. It could still maintain power even with the minority government. It could basically get a coalition together and that kind of stuff as well. So there is a significant chance that the ANC retains some kind of power. It's not going to be a case of, it's going to be a DA or EFF or MK government. The ANC remains the largest party, and nobody has seen out there has discussed anybody or any single party being able to basically replace them as the number one party. And in fact, most places have a difficulty replacing them as a number one party, even in combination with of any two parties, quite frankly, don't, in some polls have the ability to replace the ANC. So they're going to be the largest party by quite a large margin, but they may not be the largest party or a party that's large enough to have more than half of the seats. And that's obviously is going to be a bit of a change. They have to be more of a cooperation between them and some, smaller parties. We'll discuss that. The opposition parties in South Africa, I think, are maturing to a certain extent. The EFF is no longer a startup. We've had, of course, the DA been around for a long time, but we've also had the emergence of new parties like MK, which we'll discuss as well, which many in this particular, thing are going to be surprised at how well they are, ranking at the moment in some of these polls. And of course, for the first time, if this does occur, we'll have coalitions in this country. We've had coalitions on the provincial, on the municipal level before. We've never had a coalition on the national level, except for the Government of National Unity at the start. But even then, the ANC was the big party, and they kind of like, wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of unity? But now we could have a situation where for the ANC to do things, it's going to need the cooperation of other parties. And I don't know if you've seen what's happened to municipalities that have had that kind of situation going on for a while. It doesn't often end very well. Okay, let's look at the polls. This is probably why you guys are here. Okay, here are the latest polls coming out as I've seen them over the last week or so. Okay, now you must understand that the polling is very is very poor in South Africa. We are not like the US where you have this very tiny range of errors, and you pretty much know who's going to win, even though the difference between the two parties are could be 1 or 2%. They get that wrong sometimes. Election Donald Trump, I think on the day of the election, you had statisticians from like Ivy League saying there's a 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 chance of Donald Trump winning, and he did win, quite easily. So even with very good polling, you do get, surprises. But in South Africa, our polling is remarkably, flexible, and you can see some of the ranges we're talking about here and just what's been happening. Okay, let's start off with the ANC. The ANC's ranges over the last, I would say, 3 months or so, range between 37% and 45%. Right now, we are closer to 45% than the 37%, and the trend over the last few weeks has been rising. So the ANC looks to be doing better right now than it was, say, 2-3 months ago. The DA is basically 22 to 26%. That's the range they're looking at the moment, between the highest and lowest in polling. And they seem to be falling, not dramatically, but I mean, you go back a few months ago when they were looking closer to, say, 25. Right now, they're looking closer to 23. So it's a couple percentage point fall. The ANC difference, by the way, from bottom to top is very high. 37 to 45% is a huge differential. MK, this is Jacob Zuma's party. Their range is 8 to 13%. And they seem to be rising. If you go back, when they first started announced their run, they were low single digits, if that. And right now, lots of polls I'm seeing are putting them basically above 10%. Now, currently, they're not at quite 13, but they have hit 13 before. And, them hitting 10% plus is, I think, a reasonable chance if the polling is correct. But like I said, the polling is very uncertain. The EFF, 8 to 12%. Their highs are not quite as high as the MK's highs. They're a bit more stable in terms of their, polling numbers. But the trend has been to see the EFF come down slightly over the last three months or so. And the IFP, very steady, 4 to 5%, almost like, bouncing between the two levels. So a really stable player out there. Surprising to see that the IFP is not polling as well as MK is, by the way. MK seems to be, doing a lot better than you would have thought, considering, just general impressions that you see in the news media, just what you would believe in terms of, Jacob Zuma's tarnished image, from his run, etc., from his presidency. But it does seem that he has a very strong, very dedicated base, and that seems to be holding him up at the moment, especially in KZN. Okay. So what we'll do now is look at some scenarios, look at each of these parties and see what's happening with them. Okay, the ANC, like I said, the range is 37 to 45%. And the weird thing here is that it does appear that models which have lower turnout seem to benefit the ANC. It's not a huge differential, but lower turnout models benefit the ANC. Maybe it's more hardcore people voting only, and therefore they get a bigger share of this hardcore voters who are, ANC, forever. And so they do seem to be, benefiting from a lower turnout. Okay, the turnout gets to like 67+%. Their numbers go down a little bit. At the current point, it doesn't go down back to 37, but it does drop down from just below 45 to close to 40. Rising from low, so they seem to be on the upward trajectory. They were 37%, like I said, a month or so ago, and now they're closer to 45. That number actually is pretty important, I would think. The 45 is a number. We'll come to it in a second. So if this is the case, a few months ago, they were sitting at 37, now they're 45. That's an 8% move in a couple of months. Can they not do 5% more in a month? Okay, that's possible. Unlikely, according to the polling I've seen, but it is possible. And that's something to keep in mind. Don't be absolutely gobsmacked if the ANC gets 50%. Right now, it's not the majority position, but it is a possibility, and it's definitely more possibility now than it was a couple of months ago when we were sitting close to 37%. Now, an important number to think about is about 45%. Obviously 44, 46, doesn't really matter, but around about that level. 44-45%, what can happen there? You can go into coalition with the smaller parties. You can maybe get a 2% party like, the ACDP, or what is it party like ACDP? It's like it doesn't know what the polls for the smaller parties are, quite, difficult to like get a clear handle on. But, those parties get 1 or 2%. You get 2 or 3 of them together, you got your 5% to get you to 50. And once you're at 50, you effectively are back to normal. So the ANC has been historically reasonably good at doing this. They've been willing to give up quite significant power to very small parties. They're seeing in Joburg, with the mayor of Joburg. At one point in time was a guy with just like, I think, 1 seat or 2 seats. It was very, very small. And he basically been mayor of the largest city in the country because of the fact that, his vote was needed. And the ANC has been willing to do that kind of stuff, really over-reward a 1 or 2% party with ministries, with, with power, with, a lot of office and so on, in order to get over the last little hump. And as a person from a smaller party, it kind of makes sense. If you're a minister, you get the ministerial pension, especially if you stick around for a long enough time. The ministerial pension is like, a nice little nest egg for you to basically retire on, or basically retire on. And if you are some of these smaller parties, they're often driven by 1 or 2, charismatic figures. I don't know what, the outlook is for, like, for Gayton McKenzie's party, for instance, but it's definitely Gayton McKenzie's party. Like, Patricia DeLille, which was good and so on. Those were like individual-driven parties. Remember back in the day, it was Amichandra Rajbansi, and he basically had a party that was basically his party. Even when he passed away, I think his wife took over it or something. And those kind of smaller parties are more amenable, I think, to some of these things. They're more driven by personality than by any particular kind of philosophy. And at 45%, you can get a handful of those together, reward the people in charge quite nicely, give them a nice little, government pension, and they might be willing to just switch over, or give them, kind of control over very important ministries and that kind of stuff. And you can make your own decisions from there. However, if you get close to 40%, then you're getting into a different situation. Why? Because at 40%, you really can't make a coalition of the other guys. Think about it. Say DA is sitting around about, say, 25%, 24% or so. EFF plus, the MK together comes to 25, 6%. That's half the government. Unless you get every single of the smaller parties together, including the IFP, you can't really form a coalition. And you have everyone that's in there basically knows that you're dependent on them. That gives a lot of power to the minority parties. So in that scenario, what are you going to be doing? You want to basically go out and get a deal with one of the big opposition parties, and then, if needed, fill up the gap with the smaller parties. Get up to like 48, 49% with a coalition with the EFF, and fill up the next 1 or 2% with a smaller party. You don't want to be trying to wake up for like 40% or 40 to 50%, like the whole 10%. You don't want to be making that up from smaller parties. It's just going to give them too much power, too much bargaining, ability, and therefore you're going to be in real trouble trying to run a country efficiently and effectively with that. DA. Now, the DA, basically, what we're looking at is, like I said, 22 to 26%. Again, with the ANC, it's strange enough, both the DA and the ANC, better turnout is bad for them. Lower turnout is better for them. They have a lot in the Western Cape. It does seem to be that they are very, very strong there, well above 60%. Oh, definitely above 50, but above 60 as well, like most polls, all about 60. Just to be aware, there's some weird polls out there. Like Independent Newspapers has a poll that has the ANC below 20%. It's like, some weird stuff out there. So there are strange polls out there. And you must be aware that, you will get these outlier numbers. And so that's what the difficulty is in South Africa. Like I said, the polling quality isn't great. But it does appear right now that the ANC is pulling back and the DA is kind of slightly improving, okay? So 22 to 26%, better turnout is bad for them, lower turnout is good for them. They have a lock on the Western Cape. They are second to the ANC in counting, but they're definitely losing to the ANC in counting. However, the ANC does not get a majority in counting. They basically have the biggest party, but not a majority. They will probably need to go into partnership with somebody. They are definitely in a better position than the DA is to try and get into that partnership, because the DA, like I said, is definitely a second party in counting. And their third, by the way, in KZN, the MK, which we'll discuss in a bit, is actually the second or first party in KZN. It's got to some polls. So it's really close with the MK in KZN. And, you know, if you just look at their overall appeal, it primarily seems to be coming from that one province. MK, like I said, 8 to 13%, big range, but even 8% is a substantial party. You know what I mean? It is easily the fourth largest party, significantly larger than the IFP, significantly, larger than most parties out there, which are, like I said, 1 or 2%. It will only be behind effectively the ANC and the DA in terms of real stature, and be really up there competing with the EFF in terms of actual, sort of popularity. It's a Jacob Zuma party. So Jacob Zuma to start this. It's a weird situation there with Zuma and MK, but it is a one-person driven party, and therefore maybe when it comes to deal making and a bunch of other things, it might be more amenable to deal making than, for instance, the EFF is. The EFF is also kind of a one-person party with James Malema, but I think there's more structure around, philosophy, etc. At the EFF than they would be with the MK. Now, rising but volatile. So their numbers are going up, but they're pretty volatile. And they do go up and down a bit more than the other parties, especially when you look in proportional terms. I mean, for them to basically go up, from their own base 20%, downward base 20%, is much more common for that to happen than for the ANC or the EFF or the DA to move that much relatively. So that is a significant, I would think, level of uncertainty about the polling. You take out MK from it, the whole poll looks different. And if for some reason the pollsters are polling MK way too high, let's say MK is actually 3%, not 8 to 30%, then everything else looks very different. If I were the R 30%, then they are the third largest party in the country. They're about half the size of the DA. They're about a third of the size of the ANC, and they would be a few percentage points above the EFF at that level, and that would make them a serious player in the world. They are extremely competitive in KZN. This seems to be their base. And in terms of the provincial numbers, they are neck and neck with the ANC in those numbers. The DA would effectively be able to play kingmaker there, because I think neither of them is going to be able to get that majority, but or 50%. But each of them are going to be having about just about the same amount of percentage points if we're looking at the current polling. So both of them pretty even above the DA, but the DA could easily step in and be kingmaker in the scenario, giving either of these parties the ability to basically run KZN. If you have any questions so far, just feel free to put them in the Q&A or just type them in the chat. Okay. EFF, 8 to 12%, and a bit more stable in that range. You know what I mean? Slightly smaller range, but more stability. The 8 to the 12%. The 12% is close to what they look like. The 8% looks to be more of maybe more of a blip in terms of polling. But I had to put it in there. They seem to be falling. They seem to be going down a little bit, and they also seem to be in competition with the MK. It does seem that the MK rises, the EFF falls, and vice versa. That relationship, I think, is stronger than the relationship between the ANC and the MK, for instance. It does seem that these guys are fighting for kind of like the same, marginal voter. Of course, there is a Valerie raised her hand. Vakele, sorry. Vakele raised your hand. You can just type it in chat, or you can type in the Q&A if you want to. Vakele. Okay. Yeah, so the EFF does seem to be in competition with MK according to the polls. I know, ability to know what's happening beyond the polls here. I don't have any particular, ear to the ground in KZN and so on. But if you follow the polls, it does seem to be the case that the EFF and MK are kind of, competing against each other. So, Vakele, if you can put the Q&A in, the question in the Q&A, or just click on the chat or Q&A button, put that down there. We can answer that if you want. Okay. Okay. So again, some scenarios I want to be discussing here. Okay. Below a 50% coalition with smaller parties, the ANC kind of stays in power. The ANC kind of stays up there and is able to keep, I would think, most of its main power bases. To give the presidency, it might have to give up, some ministries, but it'll probably keep like the vice presidency and so on, the presidency. It would keep the important ministries. It would probably keep, the ability to do its policies as when it wants to. And one cannot argue about it in terms of the graft and other kind of stuff in the country, but that probably won't change too much in terms of levels and so on. If you have the ANC below 50%, but able to get into a coalition with a smaller party. Is MK a national regional party? MK is a national party, but with a very strong regional base. It's like they have a lot of support in KZN. That seems to be Zuma's base, but KZN is a huge province, and if you get a big support in KZN, you are going to have national support. So MK is a national party. They are in the national elections, but they basically are or have a base primarily in KZN. There are people who are going to vote for them in other parts of the country, but it's primarily a KZN-based party, but they are going for the national election. And their seats are going to count just as much as any other seats in that national election. This is a very similar situation to what you have in India. In India, there's the BJP. There's a big party. It's kind of like the major party out there. They are kind of like the DA in the scenario of in South Africa, where they were the opposition party that became the main party. Okay, the DA right now, of course, is not the main party, but they are the main opposition, and the BJP was the main opposition. India has the Indian National Congress, like the ANC has the African National Congress. Those names are not coincidences, by the way. The same kind of people that founded the Indian National Congress were actually around for the founding of the ANC, Gandhi and stuff, that interflow of ideas. So the Indian National Congress, to a certain extent, is actually an offshore, like a daughter in a certain way of the ANC. Okay, they were the party in charge for a very long time, and they did lose power for a little bit, like 30 years after taking power in India. They got it back with coalitions, and then it's better been a coalition, really heavy different thing, except for the last election where it seems that the BJP, the former opposition party, seems to be large enough that they're almost getting towards that 50% majority in terms of the government itself. The thing with coalition parties, we'll discuss in a bit, is that there's good and bad things about them. Okay. The one thing I do believe is this: if the ANC drops below 50%, Ramaphosa's days are numbered as president. He would be the guy in charge, even though it's not entirely his fault, for during the period in which the ANC fell out of majority. Think of it this way: you've had the company, running profits for 30 years since its formation, and then new CEO, and then suddenly you go into a loss. You can imagine that way. The ANC is running at profit, being majority party for all the time, basically since 1994, and then suddenly Ramaphosa is in charge, and then next election you're going to see that he's actually in charge of a party that's no longer 50% plus, it's under 50%. In that scenario, it's quite easy to see why politicians would be kicked out. And I do think Ramaphosa is in a pretty precarious state at the moment. If you remember back when he was basically appointed head of the ANC, president of the ANC, he barely beat out, NDZ, Zuma. And that meant that, he was able to defeat the Zuma faction. Because NDZ, I think, is Zuma's ex-wife and, was definitely on his side. And he just barely managed to beat them back then. So Ramaphosa basically won at a point where Zuma was very weak, where there were national protests against him, at which point there was hope from euphoria, if you guys remember that term, when people were just euphoric about the possibility that Ramaphosa was going to turn the country around. Now, with him losing the majority, with Zuma rising to some extent. And then I must mention, I don't know if this is true or not. I have no inside knowledge on this whatsoever. There are rumors that Zuma's health isn't great. That might be a fact that plays out with this. But it does seem that Jacob Zuma, from a political point of view, is stronger now than he was, back then. And this MK party, definitely does have some, clout, and that might just be something to be considered as well. So I think if we get below 50%, Ramaphosa is probably going to be out as ANC president and president of the country as well. Now, let's look at the sub 45% scenarios and go through each of them in a bit more detail. So let's look at the EFF one first of all. There are rumors that the EFF wants to have a much, much stronger a role in government if it's required to basically be a majority government or required to create a majority government. If that is the case, then what we will be seeing is, who knows, Finance Minister Floyd Shivambu, has been rumored, the ANC has denied it. They could be going towards things like, healthcare, education, who knows? But they are probably going to go in there with a philosophy that the market, I would think, generally does not believe is a good philosophy for economic growth and for prosperity going forward, or at least for asset prices rising. Maybe it's good for prosperity going forward, but the market definitely does not believe it's good for stock prices. Okay, it does not believe it's good for the currency. So you would probably find a bit of a pullback in both the scenarios, in both those areas. If the AFF does have the deciding vote, the kingmaker status with the ANC. MK, like I mentioned, is a party that's almost a one-man party, but also a one-man party where we do have a scenario where the person in charge might have issues, health issues especially. There's also legal issues still to be considered as well. There's definitely some legal, things that remain about him. Yes, he has had that those medical, boarding and so forth, but there's definitely cases that he might have to answer for. So we do have a scenario in which you do have a one-man kind of show here, but at least from the voters' point of view. And that one-man show effectively is going to have the ability to create a new government. And so maybe what he might demand from that is like some kind of immunity, some kind of lack of prosecution. That could be that if his illness is as bad as some people talk about. Could be basically just the front for another group of people behind him, and what they want exactly, we don't know. It does seem, I don't know for certain, that this party is more personality-driven than philosophy-driven, and that might be something to consider in terms of just what the outlook for the policy in terms of regulation, etc., look like. Next, the DA. Now, there's two ways to look at this. The DA could easily get into power, and no matter what the ANC gets, 35, 34, 30% even, the DA would be enough to bring them into 40, 50%. The question is this the right thing for the DA to do? Would they think this is the right thing to do? There's an argument to be made that the DA might believe that this is for the good of the country, and to prevent an EFF ANC coalition, you want to have the DA step in and kind of sacrifice themselves on the altar of the best thing for the country. If you believe politicians are more statesmen than politicians. If you do, however, believe maybe they're not, the political argument for joining the ANC is that it's power. They have power. They can basically, wield that power in certain places. They might be able to get access to certain things that they didn't have in the past. One of the things the DA really wants to do is get, control of SAPS, especially in the Western Cape, because there's a big problem with crime there. There might be something. There could be something that they could do around NHI because they don't like it all. And a number of other factors, something with BE and whatnot. So the DA has the ability to make a kingmaker, and that will give them an advantage in some political things where they can have power in certain areas. But on the other hand, if they decide not to, there's a very common saying, if your enemy is making a mistake, don't basically intervene. So the ANC is falling apart. The DA, for their own personal long-term prosperity, could say, let them fall apart. Let me step aside and let them make a mistake of joining the EFF. let them make a mistake of joining the MK and let them drive the country down. Because what happens the next election, the country is worse off than it is right now. Who's the winner? It's the DA. Whoever the ANC partners up on is going to be a winner because they are just basically going to be seen to be compatriots of the ANC, partners in crime of the ANC. The ANC won't be the winner because the ANC basically would be presiding over a country that's in a bad economic situation. The DA on that hand could just say, we weren't involved in this, and therefore whatever happened here is not our fault. It's actually the fault of the ANC and either the EMK or the EFF, whoever they decide to partner up with. And that could mean, full out victory in, say, 5 years' time, as opposed to partial victory right now. That might be a sustainable or a reasonable thing for them to be doing. And then finally, the IFP. The IFP maybe with some kind of coalition in KZN, with more power in KZN, but maybe not as much national outlook as you would basically be seeing with some of the other parties. Because the ANC will join you up in the national, government. 5% or so gets you, almost there. You can maybe put one or two smaller parties, and then you get over 50%. And we don't want the whole country. We just want KZN. We want to basically have power in KZN, and we really don't care what you do, Gauteng and whatnot. And so that could very well be an approach that could occur as well. So all of these approaches have their own particular nuances, their own particular, advantages and disadvantages. At 50% plus, the ANC is just going to continue as it is. No change, and quite frankly, no change is not good. No change means a continuation of load shedding. No change means a continuation of high unemployment. No change means a continuation of a number of different factors that are quite unsustainable in the long term. Below 50%, you're looking at a coalition. Still with the ANC in charge, but a coalition that's going to be very important, I think, with regards to just determining a couple small things, but more importantly, but just kind of keeping things in kind of hand for the ANC. Sub 45%, then we really get into the interesting thing. And depending on who says what here or who does what here, it could be very different outcomes. And ANC DA coalition is going to be very different from MK or ANC EFF coalition. And here, I think the best scenario for the ANC is that they have enough support from the small parties to have an ANC IFP coalition with a couple smaller companies or smaller players coming in and helping them out to get over 50%. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Let's have a question. People seem to be interested in the MK a lot. So I do think that the MK basically, we don't see it in Gauteng, in Gauteng, basic Gauteng. You may not see it in your social circles, but reliable people have told me that the support for the ANC, so the MK in certain parts of KZN is pretty strong. So it is not surprising that they're doing as well as they are. And the one data point I'd put up as confirmation of this is, remember when they put Zuma in prison, I think it's 2021 or something, and then you had a situation where you had Durban kind of burn for like 2 weeks because of the rioting and so on that came about because Zuma was in jail. That, I think, is a indicator of the popular support he has, So impact, ANC about 50%, no change. This is the country as it is, below 50% coalitions. Now, here's some interesting things. When it comes to what happens with regards to, coalitions, the data is kind of mixed here. It does seem that countries with coalitions or coalition governments have a better track record of repaying their debts than countries without. When it comes to repaying a debt, very few countries don't repay the debt because they can't afford to. They don't repay the debt because they're not willing to make the sacrifices that are required to afford it. Cutting back on social spending, cutting back on wages, cutting back on different things. So when it comes to coalition governments, it's possible for whatever reason that coalition governments are more willing to pay that higher price. Maybe they can deflect some of the pain, or maybe they basically don't have power to make the call to basically default. And so historically, you do find that countries that do have coalition governments pay their debts more regularly than countries that don't have coalition governments and they have a single party rule. Single party rule seems to be correlated quite strongly with not repaying your debts. Next, accountability. So it's possible that by having an outside party being involved in the government, be the EFF, MK, or DA, or whoever it may be, or the IFP, that gives you greater accountability because the party can't just say, forget about it, we are in charge, we do what we want to do, and you basically get to sit down. That is a different possibility. However, I would put the following, thing up there as well. We have seen in South Africa that there's been coalitions being formed in some municipalities, and I would not argue that that has increased accountability. What it rather has happened is increased the amount of blackmail that's happened behind the scenes for the smaller parties in order to keep the larger parties in power, and that's resulted in more graft and more other issues down the line. Next, grand gestures. Sometimes when you're basically losing, you're more willing to make the grand gesture because in that scenario, you'd be more willing to, just win, and it doesn't matter what you're basically ruling afterwards. If you're going to lose, you don't really care if you're going to, lose and have a prospering country or lose and have a failing country. I'm saying from a political point of view, not from a statesman patriotic point of view. And so sometimes when we do see this happen in some countries, is that when a party in charge is about to lose or is going to sit back, they go out to make a grand gesture. An example I put like in India is right now. India has what's called the India Alliance. This alliance is the old ruling party, Indian National Congress, and a couple other smaller regional parties, and they have an alliance together. And one of their particular proposals, not some of the proposals are like things like giving every human, every woman a certain amount of money, giving like kid a certain amount of money, every household a certain like amount of goods and services, all for free, by the way. They also basically want to remove all limits on reservations. So right now in India, you can't have more than half the jobs reserved for socioeconomic reasons and so on. And they want to remove that. So they want to have more than half the jobs basically reserved. There's half the jobs at government as well as half positions at private universities and so on. And they want to have that reserved for whoever they want to be reserved for. There's reservations, they want it to be above 50%. Which would probably be a very bad thing for the country when you have more than half the positions in government filled by people that don't have, the best marks, the best whatever. It could be very bad. You have half positions at university filled by the people that don't, have the best marks, so it could be very bad. The ANC chose, BE stuff in South Africa, but imagine that on steroids, and that I think is the kind of stuff that they're going for in India at the moment. And these grand gestures, like I said, are fueled by the fear of losing power. So a smaller party may be saying, or a party that's about to lose may be saying, hey, if we lose, we are out of the, in the cold for 5 years, 10 years, who knows how long. But if we can somehow maintain power, we have 5 more years to be in power. We might be able to basically turn things around, but, we can only benefit from that if we are actually in power. And so in order to remain in power, what we'll do is give away freebies, give away, these grand gestures, and that might just be something that's going to be suitable in order to maintain our power. And that's a big danger. It's actually one of the biggest dangers about these things because, these grand gestures are often uneconomical, unaffordable. We don't know how we're going to ever pay for them. And they do often reduce economic prosperity and growth long term. And there comes the last bit, instability. The one thing I can say for certain is that the ANC falls below 50%. The level of instability in this country rises because we don't know who's in charge. We don't know who's going to be the party that's going to be the responsible party. The ANC, for all its flaws, has been pretty responsible. It's done mouth service for a lot of really radical plans. But you compare the plans of ANC to workers and so on, the plans the country's actually doing, and you find that the ANC is a very, very slow, steady walker compared to some of these other places out there. And I think that's an important factor to keep in mind, that we are looking at a change of this current status quo. And when this change is over, you can have a very different kind of setup in the country, maybe more short-term setup than you have right now. Investments. So this is speculation. I have no guarantee that this is going to be true or not, but let's look at some speculation as to what might happen after this particular election. So currency, like I mentioned to you, EFF, MK, and government, I would expect the currency to weaken. That's just the knee-jerk reaction. ANC-DA coalition would probably strengthen the currency. So currency probably weakens if the ANC basically gets below 50 and has to go into partnership with the MK or the EFF. The economic growth at the moment is in the doldrums. One would almost wonder if there's anything that could be worse than what we are right now. And unfortunately, there is. Especially if you have, like, the EFF coming to power and they have some rather unorthodox economic ideas that are not based on any economic theory that has historically proven to be correct. Let me put it that way. In that scenario, what we could easily be seeing is more regulation, government, more red tape, more difficulty operating, higher taxation, more dependency on social grants, and so on. And in that scenario, I think the economy would probably do worse than it is doing right now. If we had the MK coming to power, I think because they're not as philosophically, stringent as the EFF is, or strict as the EFF is, we could easily find that it almost becomes an ANC as per normal, with some ministries and so on changing power. Especially if you think of the fact that the current head of MK was the former head of the ANC, and apparently, to some rules I've said so far, is still a member of the ANC. Regulations, I think to a certain extent would probably be better off if there was a coalition, just because it's more difficult to move things through a coalition than it is through one-party state. That being said, it's also going to be more difficult to change regulation once it's in place, and you could have more of a regulatory backlog. So if you try something that doesn't work, it may take longer to correct it than it does right now. So overall, the choice is going to be SA focused or offshore. If you're looking for greater stability, if you're looking for greater certainty about your investments at the moment, I would think that being offshore would probably give you a better bit of stability in terms of just returns and so on. Being entirely local, being focused on SA, being focused on SA Inc. and certain the other parts of the SA GDP, so just stock exchange. That I think is going to be a bit more volatile. I think it's going to be a bit more unpredictable, just because we are going to be seeing, more driving forces towards doing something about some things like the unemployment and the gap in this country, the amount of low economic growth we have in the country, and I think without the actual, control that we would see from a one-party state, a lot of the stuff is going to be ill thought out, not ideal, and that could result in a negative effect on SA Inc. And then offshore. If you go offshore, you're pretty much immune to all the stuff here. South Africa is a tiny portion of the global GDP. It's a tiny portion of the world's financial markets. And if you look at it from that point of view, if we had to fall in bed tomorrow and the South African JSE fell down 50% or 60%, 100% even, if there's a massive recession starting tomorrow for whatever reason, if you were based in the US, you're based in Europe, you're based elsewhere in the world, you're pretty much protected. Okay? And that's it. I'll now start taking any questions you guys might have. Put your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A section. A question with the EFF, basically asking what ministries the EFF want if they had to be in power. Like I mentioned, probably finance ministry would probably be the first prize. If you think about it, in the one person that the EFF has really gone after has been Praveen Gordhan, and he's was head of the finance ministry. So they obviously pay attention to that military ministry. That might be something to be looked at. So I don't know if what other things they might be looking at, but I definitely think that if they had a prize, it would be the finance ministry. And that would be, I think, quite bad for the country. It would be the EFF has policies that are basically have been proven to be negative economic growth globally. And I don't think that's going to change in South Africa. Okay, anyone else? Okay, the question is how to get money out of the country. Simple, give us a call. If it's under a million rands, it's pretty much a form you sign yourself and just a bit of fika. If it's more than a million rands, tax clearance, but we can help you with that. And we know all the tricks on how to get you your tax clearance done. More than about 11 million per person, then you're going to have to maybe look at taking it over multiple years, or if you really need to do it, let's just say you have a couple of 100 million or something like that, then we will get a lawyer involved, and that will be what's involved in getting some approval to get that money out of the country. Once your money is out of the country, where you get to is obviously a discussion we need to have. Could be in shares, could be in structured products, could be in anything you want to. The world is a very, very, very place. More ability to invest in different things than there is in South Africa. And so depending whatever you want to look at, we can help you with that as well. Anyone else? Okay. It's been about 45 minutes then. If you have any questions, feel free to put them through or email me, viv@ransford.com. Like I said, we're going to have a very interesting election season coming up. And I do think that, this is going to be one of those times in which the kind of thing they always say, that every election is the most important election ever. This is going to be a very important election. This is going to be the most important election in South Africa since basically 1994, sorry. It's going to potentially have the biggest upsets in 1994 in terms of the political system. And it's going to have the biggest, I think, potential to actually change the country that we've had recently. Okay. Thanks for joining me. And I look forward to basically speaking to you guys again if you have any questions, or speaking to you guys at the next weekly meeting we have, or the weekly wrap you do. Cheers, guys.